Welcome back to DM Gives Inspiration. Season 9, Episode 10, a Mailbag episode. Got lots of questions today, and you'll forgive me after 90 episodes if some of them might be repeats of previous topics. But these questions are wholly unique because they're posed in a number of different ways involving different scenarios and different types of players. So, diving right in, let's start with Thomas's email, which was sent using the contact link over at kylefergusson.com. I was wondering if you'd be willing to give some advice as I'm having trouble getting the mood really set for my game. One of the reasons for the trouble is I can't strike a balance on how long to wait for them to talk, them being the players. There are times when I have given them the environment and their NPC has told them something, but I sit for what seems like forever waiting for someone to respond or to speak at all. How do I facilitate more interaction from players who are struggling with roleplay? Also, I have wondered how you prepare for a typical session. I just can't seem to capture the mood for my players. Going into the session, there seems to be a lot of awkward pauses, and my players just sort of asking questions, but not really jumping into the world. There's a theme here. How do I get my players to interact? How do I get my players in the mood? And overall, you want to remove the awkwardness at your table. There are many reasons why your table can be awkward or slow to roleplay. From your email, I know that you're running a pre-made setting, or at least Baldur's Gate. There could be a pacing issue. The world could seem too rich, too daunting for the players, and they're not sure of their place in it, so they're afraid to interact. While this doesn't sound like your situation, DMs can sometimes punish players for role-playing poorly or not fast enough, and so players become even more reserved, afraid that they'll make the wrong choice. After all, combat is turn-based. Why can't social interaction be? If they're coming from a Bethesda game, Fallout, Elder Scrolls, or a role-playing game like Divinity 2, a BioWare game, they might just need more time to react. And they might enjoy taking that moment to think about what they want to say. Those games, particularly their more modern incarnations, often alert the player what stat is going to be used, or skill is associated with the response they have. A lot of role-heavy games or actors DMs ask for rolls on the back end. Oh, that sounded like a lie. Would you like to make a deception? In this case, you could give your players a sort of roadmap to the roleplay. Let them know that intimidation, deception, persuasion are all on the table here. And then depending on that player, that role can stand in for the role play. They roll a 10 on intimidation. You say some harsh words, but they don't quite hit home. All that acting can be on the DM's side if we want it to. You could tell the player what their character just did. Some players are just really shy, and asking them to roleplay is too much. And asking them to perform the role they just rolled is not any easier. And while you didn't say in your email here that you had shy players, it sounds like you don't have a performer at your table. This kind of player often makes themselves the leader of the group, the one who's first to go into the conversations, drives the plot, and maybe steers it a little towards their own backstory at times. Their roleplay and investment can cover for other players who aren't quite as active. But it also is an example of roleplay at your table that others can follow. And a really good performer, an actor, an improviser, will work the other characters into their performance. They will prompt them, ask them what they think in character, get them involved in the current situation. What say you, Master Druid, and the like? A great player acknowledges that their one character doesn't have all the skills necessary to win the game. They need that animal handling from the ranger. They need that perspective of the arcane arts from the wizard. And they help pull that out of them. A little off the path. You don't just go out and find yourself an amazing player and add them to your group. But sometimes table dynamics can be the cause of the issue. That doesn't mean you can't play D&D, but perhaps something more Monster of the Week style, combat focused, would be better for this group. Then once they're involved in the story, they have reactions to certain types of monsters, opinions about certain kinds of quests, emotions about NPCs they've dealt with in the past. we can lay on the roleplay more heavily at that point. For that kind of group, it's really important to have that hamlet, small town start before you hit the big city. And it's not too late for that. Perhaps pause things in Baldur's Gate for a while and send them out on a wilderness quest. Let them go explore, let them enjoy the mechanics of the game, and as they define who their characters are and what they're good at, we can bring them back to that social interaction. It's easy to forget how stressful this stuff is. Whether you've led a guild in an MMO, you do presentations at your work, you do a lot of remote meetings where you're on camera or hearing your own voice, whatever it is that got people out of their shell, they were in their shell in the first place. As the DM, we have all this momentum. We've been planning, we've been purchasing, we've scheduled a date, we've got everyone together. It's all on you, you better do something. And so you start talking, and once you're talking, it's not that bad. But the players haven't been planning this out for 2 weeks. They just got there. So the spotlight can feel very sudden and scary. So slow things down. Instead of an NPC, it's a talking statue. It doesn't really care how long it takes for the players to respond. Instead of having to imagine themselves stepping out the door into a living, breathing metropolis, they're camping. But there's monsters in these woods. What do you do when you wake up? What do you have for breakfast? If they want to hunt, they hunt. They forage for berries, they forage for berries. And this works into your second question about how you prepare for the session in order to get the players in the mood. If they're slow starters, give them slow starts. At the end of your sessions, find that ending where they take their long rest, where they go to bed, they get in the cart for a long travel. So when you start the next session, it's slow. They disembark. They wake up. They emerge from the cave where they just defeated the dragon and now have to make their way back home. And on that walk, during that wake up, they get that time to get in the mood. It's also very helpful to do a little summary of what happened last time. You can cue the players to do this, as I've talked about in the past, or you can be the one to list all the information that you remember from the previous session. A lot of players, though it might be frustrating to DMs who have been working since the last session, don't remember what happened last time. A little prompting can help get them in the mood. Maybe you could replay that battle soundtrack you had for the previous boss while you talk about it. Chris B asks our next question. Somewhat of a touchy subject, perhaps, but I'm wondering how to handle evil races, like goblins, gnolls, orcs, etc. I find it hard to give them personality, so they might be seen as intelligent and not feel like walking XP for the players, without it feeling distasteful as a DM to say a race of sentient beings, like goblins or gnolls, are inherently evil. I might be overanalyzing it since it's just a game, but I don't want to create another fantasy world where the good guys are clean, white, and Western, and the evil races are nomadic, coded as non-Westerns, and dirtier corrupted. Gondor and the elves versus orcs or Easterlings from Lord of the Rings, for example, even as a big Tolkien fan. Wizards of the Coast and the creators of D&D don't have an answer for us. They are trying new things, like Eberron, Rise of the Last War, or The Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, where orcs and drow are shown as complex individuals, with a whole range of moralities. There are no heavy rules as to their alignment, there are just cultures that they exist in. Wizards of the Coast has been reprinting and changing some of the choices they made in things like Tomb of Annihilation or Curse of Strahd, where their evil peoples were based more on stereotypes. And back in June 2020, Wizards of the Coast promised that they were going to put out a book that would help solve these problems. But what they ended up releasing was Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which had Chapter 1 character options, which basically amounted to do what you want. If you don't want to have certain stats associated with certain races or certain alignments associated with certain races, change it. And that was their advice, which was pretty unsatisfying. However, alignment in particular has not been utilized in this edition. There are very few items, most of them artifacts, that interact with alignment. The old protection spells that play directly into alignment have all been combined into protection from good and evil, which is more of a protection from monster types than anything to do with alignment in the first place. And dedicating a couple of pages to Tasha's Cauldron of Everything may have been frustrating for those of us who wanted more of an answer. It's very important for raw players, rules as written players, to have a source that mentions these things, because when you get involved in a raw game, they tell you which books are on the table for your options. By saying Tasha's Cauldron of Everything is available, you can now make use of these customized origin options and customizing races and the like. So based on the creators' choices and the rules they've made, we can say that alignment doesn't matter as a mechanic. Therefore, there is no mechanical advantage. It does not improve your game if you follow the racial alignments that are in the book. So getting back to your email, you ask a lot of big questions. And answering these questions for yourself at your own table will lead to a more rich world. You have the power to change anything in those books, and mechanically the game will not suffer. By answering those lore questions, but why, but why, but why, you find that nuance you're looking for, and you move away from that walking XP, as you put it. Of course, there are many other facets to your questions and problems that can develop in fantasy, particularly involving fantasy races, which are better addressed in a long-form episode of its own. I got a lot of emails, all from different writers, who all kind of asked the same question, so I'm going to combine it into one question for everyone here. How do I get my big bad to feel like a real fight? A lot of people are concerned that after all this buildup and all this questing and time invested in the game, that their final big bad is going to fizzle. Their villain isn't going to be challenging enough in the combat sphere to make it all feel worth it. How do you know your big bad combat is going to be good? D&D since 3rd edition has moved towards a more miniature-based combat system. And with that miniature system, there is an expectation that villains will have an entourage. They will have minions with them. They'll have fodder to sort of pad things out. Particularly when we look at our spellcasters, which there is a high likelihood that your main boss is going to be a lich, a mummy lord, a mage, and they all have horrible hit points. And no matter how many minions or guardians you put with that boss, players are going to aim for them first. They're wearing robes, they're casting spells, and they've been the source of the player's frustration for this entire campaign. They don't care about the skeletons. They don't care about the cultists summoning the astral deities. They just want to kill the big bad. So one of the first things you can do is double or triple the boss's health, depending on your player's throughput. You should have a pretty good idea of what that is at that point. If you have a party with 2 healers and a tank, they're going to do less damage than 3 fighters. Fighter damage is going to look very different than 3 wizards. Your wizards may love having a whole board full of minions to blow away with their fireballs. The fighters, on the other hand, would struggle with such a combat, would be overwhelmed. But I personally like my big villain fight to be one-on-one or one-on-player party size. I want them to face them alone. And they have a lot of great spells that they will never get to if you use the standard hit points. So triple the hit points. This gives you the time you need to showcase all those abilities. The challenge rating 6 mage makes a really good first villain. But at 40 hit points, you're never going to show off Cone of Cold, and Ice Storm, and Fireball. The players need permission to go all out, and you can show that in your own play. Your mage starts with mage armor already on. They cast as a reaction shield and protect themselves. They use their bonus action to cast Misty Step to break flanks and surrounds that may have happened. With that Misty Step, they teleport to a new location that's advantageous for that fireball. All the spell slots are being spent. Counter spells are being used as reactions. It's an all-out war, and it's going to take some practice, which you don't have because you only get to do your big villain fight once. Now, there is a trick you can perform. They could fight the big bad early in a dream, or they could fight shades or copies and any other manner of story device where you get to run this mage in advance. It's never to the death, the mage illusion always disappears, but you get to play around with this list of spells and get some practice. If you don't have the time for that, or your story doesn't allow for that sort of mechanic, get out a piece of paper and write down turn for turn what you're going to do every single round. What spell you're going to lead with, which one comes next. Which reactions do you have on tap? What's your bonus action going to be? Do you need to add in more spells? Maybe your spellcaster didn't come with a bonus action. Maybe they don't have a teleport to get away from those flanks and surrounds that are bound to happen. If what you're using is not a spellcaster, let's say a dragon as your final villain, that's where those big hit points are going to come in handy. You need to keep moving. Don't let things be static. Your dragon is flying around, making attacks on the go. There will be a lot of attacks of opportunity in this case, but that's what those hit points are for. I find when you're going all out like this, it is extremely helpful to say the names of the spells you're using and say the names of the attacks from the monster stat sheet that you're looking at. This lets players know that they're not being cheated, that you're using an official stat sheet, and that you're going all out with every ability that you have, rather than it turning into a nebulous mix of magic and attacks. If you are home ruling your final villain, it's still not a bad idea to use actual spells from the player's handbook. The final question for this mailbag is another amalgamation of emails I receive. How do I deal with frustration? What do I do when my players ignore or miss things that I worked hard on? It's a very simple answer. Your players didn't know about it, so they haven't missed anything. Nothing's been lost in their minds. If they're enjoying themselves, you're doing your job. That's also why it's important to take good notes, so that when they do miss things, or they don't take advantage of that great trap you made, you can use it again in the future. Nothing's been spoiled. You can always pick out that element and move it to another game session. Thank you everyone for joining me for Season 9 of DM Gives Inspiration. I want to thank all the supporters over at patreon.com/Kyle Fergusson who helped make this show and many others like it possible. Music was by Brian Griffith. I will see you for Season 10 of DM Gives Inspiration after the new year. Good luck in your games and at your table. Take care.